The fluorescent lights of Mercy General's emergency department hummed their mechanical song as Danielle Ross clocked in at 6:27 a.m., 19 minutes before her shift officially started. The ER was already moving, stretchers rolling, monitors beeping their steady rhythm, the antiseptic smell of the department mixing with something underneath it, something like fear and diesel exhaust bleeding in from the ambulance bay. She moved through the controlled chaos with the kind of invisibility that comes from years of practice, her movements economical and purposeful, drawing no attention. A first-year resident was already making rounds, speaking loudly about a patient in Trauma Bay 3, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never been truly tested. Danielle said nothing. She moved to the supply room, checking the crash cart with methodical precision, checking airway equipment, verifying medication doses, her hands moving through the sequence with muscle memory so old it predated most of the staff here by 2 decades. A patient in Bay 2 needed therefore restarted, and she was there before anyone asked, her touch gentle but certain, the needle finding the vein on the first attempt. The patient exhaled with relief. Danielle merely nodded and moved to the next crisis, the next small problem she could solve without speaking. The new chief of emergency medicine arrived at 7:15 a.m., and everyone felt it before they saw him. Dr. Sterling moved through the department like a man accustomed to parting crowds, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the tile with the rhythm of a metronome keeping time. He was tall, with the kind of jawline that looked sculptured from granite and the kind of confidence that filled a room the way flood water fills a basement, quietly, completely, and with the understanding that it didn't ask permission. His white coat was crisp, unmarked, the badge hanging from a lanyard that cost more than some people's monthly rent. He was here to inspect his kingdom. To identify weakness. Danielle was working through the morning triage when she felt his attention settle on her like a rifle scope finding a target. She was triaging a diabetic patient in the waiting area, speaking in low, steady tones, asking the right questions in the right order, glycemic history, medication compliance, last meal, visual changes, extremity numbness. Her assessment would be more thorough than the one that would come from the physicians. But no one needed to know that. Sterling watched her work. He watched how she deferred to the first-year resident in Bay 4, how she accepted the resident's assessment of a chest pain presentation without challenging it, despite the fact that the resident had misread the EKG and missed the subtle ST elevation that meant acute coronary syndrome. Danielle caught it later, during her own check, and communicated it to the attending without making the resident look foolish. But Sterling's eyes had already moved on. She wasn't ambitious. She wasn't trying to climb. She flinched when he raised his voice 2 hours later about discharge paperwork protocols. He smiled the smile of a man who had found exactly what he was looking for. At noon, Sterling convened the staff in the lounge. It was a small gathering, maybe 12 people, nurses and techs and a couple of attending physicians who wanted to hear from the new chief. The lounge smelled like burnt coffee and the ghost of 1,000 lunches. Sterling stood with his shoulders back, his presence occupying more space than his physical body should allow, like something about him made the air pressure change around him. "I want to talk about excellence," Sterling began, his voice smooth as oil spreading across still water. "I've been here 72 hours. 72 hours. And I've already identified who the real players are in this department. People with ambition. People with vision." He paused, letting his gaze move across the room. "And I've identified who's just taking up space." No one spoke. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, and somewhere in the distance, an ambulance siren wailed. "There's one nurse here," Sterling continued, his eyes finding Danielle for just a moment before moving away, "who I've had my eye on. Quiet. Doesn't ask questions. Doesn't challenge authority. Doesn't want responsibility." He smiled. It was not a warm smile. "I'm going to make a bet. A public bet. That she quits within 7 days. She'll realize very quickly that she's not cut out for a department under my command. Too much pressure. Too much accountability. She's the type who needs to hide. And I don't tolerate hiding." The room went so quiet you could hear the refrigerator humming in the corner, the rhythmic drip of the coffee maker's last offerings. Sterling left the room. People shifted, looked away, suddenly very interested in their phones or their lunch or the pattern of water stains on the ceiling tiles. No one looked at Danielle directly, but she felt their eyes moving around her like water flowing around a stone in a river. She said nothing. She turned back to the break room's bulletin board and looked at the posted schedule, her expression not changing, her breathing steady. Then she excused herself, told another nurse she was taking her lunch break early, and walked to the supply closet. The supply closet was not meant for eating, but Danielle had long ago learned that it was the only place in the hospital where she could sit alone. It was a small room, barely larger than a bathroom, lined with shelves holding compressed bandages, for fluids, dressing supplies, boxes of nitrile gloves in sizes from pediatric to adult. She sat on a plastic storage container near the back, in the corner where the shadows made her nearly invisible. She pulled a container from her bag, leftover salmon and rice from last night, prepared at home, always prepared in advance because she had learned that the world moved faster when you were ready. She ate slowly, methodically, tasting nothing but the habit of nourishment. The scars on her shoulder blades burned sometimes, usually when she was tired or when the pressure system changed before a storm. 20 years was a long time to carry scarring, long enough that she no longer thought about how they got there in the middle of the day. Long enough that she had trained herself not to touch them, not to let anyone see how deeply they went. She heard footsteps in the hallway outside the supply closet, light, quick steps. The door opened without warning. It was Christine, one of the younger nurses, someone who had been kind enough to include Danielle in lunch conversations before Danielle had learned to avoid lunch. Christine was changing into a fresh set of scrubs, her old one soaked with something from one of the trauma cases. She didn't say anything about the supply closet or ask why Danielle was eating here like an animal in a den. She simply pulled off her soaked scrubs, and as she turned to reach for the clean ones, Danielle could see Christine's eyes catch on something, the lattice of white scar tissue that crossed both of Danielle's shoulder blades, thin lines that had been made by something sharp enough to cut through muscle, through the kind of trauma that most people didn't survive. Christine's mouth opened. Then closed. She said nothing. She finished dressing, offered a small nod of acknowledgement, and left. Some conversations were too big for words anyway. Danielle finished her lunch alone. She sat in the supply closet for another 9 minutes, not because she needed to but because this was her shift, 12 hours at Mercy General, 12 hours of being invisible, 12 hours of solving problems that no one would recognize she had solved. When she was ready, she stood, threw away her empty container, and returned to the emergency department. Her locker was on the 3rd floor in the staff area, tucked in the back corner where she kept 2 things, a dying succulent plant in a ceramic pot, and a photograph of a woman in desert fatigue standing in front of a convoy, her smile bright as desert sun. She touched the inside of her jacket, feeling for the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, Ramadi, 2004, a symbol of a life that no longer officially existed. The patch was real. Everything else had been erased. She returned to the trauma bay. The afternoon unfolded like every other afternoon at Mercy General, a succession of minor crises and major complications, of patients who needed more than medicine, they needed someone to believe they would survive. Danielle moved through it all with the kind of competence that went unnoticed precisely because it was so complete. A diabetic patient whose glucose was crashing, she was there with juice, with glucose tabs, with a steady presence that told the patient everything would be fine. An elderly man with atrial fibrillation whose heart rate was climbing, she got him calm, got him comfortable, communicated the findings to the attending before anything became critical. A child with an asthma exacerbation, she positioned him correctly, understood his fear without him saying anything, spoke to him in the voice of someone who had always known exactly what to say to the frightened. At 4:19 p.m., Dr. Sterling appeared in the department again. He was walking through with something like satisfaction on his face, like a man inspecting a property he had just purchased and deciding what he would demolish first. His eyes found Danielle working through the med station, preparing medications for a post-operative patient. He stood there for a moment, watching her, assessing. Then he moved on, heading toward the attending physician's office. The shift ended at 7 p.m. Danielle changed out of her scrubs, back into the civilian clothes she had arrived in, simple dark pants, a navy blue blouse that didn't draw attention, comfortable shoes that allowed her to move. She pulled on her jacket, the one with the patch sewn inside, and touched it once more, the way some people touched a rosary or the pendant of a cross. It was a ritual. It was a prayer. It was a memory of a woman who no longer existed outside of old photographs and classified files that were probably already marked for shredding. She walked out of Mercy General into the Norfolk evening, where the wind was picking up off the water and the sky was the color of old bruises. Somewhere out there, beyond the perimeter of this hospital, beyond the reach of Dr. Sterling's ambitions, there was a life she had lived. A life with rank and responsibility and people depending on her decisions. A life where she had been someone. But that was a long time ago. Now she was just a nurse. And that was all Sterling would ever see. He had no idea that the woman he had bet would quit within a week was the same woman who had pulled an entire fire team out of an ambush in Ramadi with shrapnel in her ribs and a bullet already passing through her shoulder. He had no idea that the invisible nurse he had dismissed without a second thought had made choices under pressure that had saved more lives than he had saved in his entire career. He had no idea that he had just made a very specific, very dangerous mistake. But he was about to find out. Not yet. Not today. But soon. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular desperation of rotating shift work. Danielle stood in the corner near the refrigerator, retrieving her lunch container, when Dr. Sterling walked in with 3 resident physicians trailing behind him like remora fish. His voice, a voice like a tank idling in a garage, all mechanical authority with no actual power underneath, filled the cramped space immediately. "Gentlemen, I'm taking bets," Sterling announced, pulling a $5 bill from his wallet with theatrical slowness. "How long before our little mouse here scurries away?" He gestured toward Danielle with his chin, not bothering to look at her directly. "I give her a week. Maybe 8 days if she's particularly stubborn." The younger doctors laughed. It was the kind of laughter that required permission, nervous, looking to Sterling for confirmation that this was acceptable behavior. One of them, a resident named Chen with nervous hands, chimed in, "My money's on 4 days." Danielle closed the refrigerator door with a soft click. She took one measured breath through her nose, held it for 4 counts, and released it slowly. Her eyes remained on the condensation dripping down her water bottle. She had triaged 16-year-old Marines with abdominal wounds that would never close properly. She had held a bleeding corpsman while his breath rattled into silence. This man's words were air currents in a room. This man was practice. "Don't worry, Mouse," Sterling said, this time making eye contact, forcing her to acknowledge him. "Plenty of jobs out there. The grocery store's always hiring." More laughter, higher pitched now, emboldened. "Or you could go back to, what was it? Doing whatever it was you did before." She walked past him toward the door. Her scrubs whispered against his as she passed. She said nothing. The silence that followed was so thick you could hear the fluorescent lights humming their AC current frequency above them. The next afternoon, Danielle stood in the cafeteria line at 1,347 hours, her tray balanced on her forearms the way cafeteria workers taught you, efficient, practiced, ready to move. Around her, clusters of doctors and nurses created pockets of laughter and low conversation. The smell of institutional gravy hung heavy under the antiseptic that no amount of bleach could fully mask from hospital cafeteria air. Sterling appeared beside her as though summoned by some cruel momentum of narrative. He was carrying his phone in one hand, his other hand loose at his side. His movements had the deliberate quality of performance, everything done for an audience, even when he thought no one was watching. Danielle picked up her apple juice. She did not see what happened next as much as feel it, a sharp contact against her tray from the side, her hand suddenly too full of falling objects. The plastic tray tilted. Her sandwich and salad and the container of rice she'd packed that morning scattered across the tile floor like casualties. The coffee cup, it was nearly full, still steaming, poured across her scrubs, soaking the white fabric dark with brown, the heat immediate and uncomfortable against her ribs. "Clumsy," Sterling said, his voice pitched to carry 3 tables over. "So clumsy, sweetheart. You should be more careful." He was smirking. His left hand was still extended, having just completed the motion. It wasn't an accident. Everyone in the cafeteria understood this instantly. They understood it the way people understand a predator entering a room, through some animal recognition center of the brain that has nothing to do with logic. Danielle knelt. The floor was still damp from morning cleaning, and the moisture seeped immediately through her scrub pants at the knee. She began gathering the scattered papers from her meal tray, the soggy napkins, the plastic containers. A nurse from pediatrics, Marcus's friend Jennifer, bent down to help her, but Sterling shook his head slightly. Just that small gesture. Jennifer stopped and stood, leaving Danielle alone on the floor. That's when the tear came. It was a single tear, not a cascade, not a breakdown. One tear because her body was making a physiological response to humiliation in front of an audience, and she was not going to stop that response by fighting it. Instead, she let it fall, and as it slid down her cheek, she wiped it away without looking away from Sterling's shoes, polished leather Oxfords, probably $300, probably purchased with money he'd earned by intimidating people exactly like this. "Accidents happen, doctor," she said. Her voice was steady as a flat line. Not shaking. Not breaking. "I'll clean this up." "See that you do," Sterling said. He walked away, his footsteps loud on the tile. The other nurses began eating again, conversations resuming at their previous volume. This was how it worked, the hierarchy reasserting itself, the proof of dominance delivered and received, life continuing. Danielle filled a trash bag with the debris of her lunch. No one spoke to her. No one made eye contact. The message was clear: association with the mouse was not career advancing. That night, she sat in her car in the parking lot of Mercy General for 45 minutes after her shift ended. She didn't drive home. She sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, one hand pressed against the faded unit patch she kept sewn into the lining of her jacket, hidden beneath her street clothes. The patch was from a unit that no longer officially existed. A unit whose members had been scattered across the classified sections of military records, erased and redistributed into silence. Her fingers traced the stitching, careful, deliberate work, the kind of work that marked something as valued, as precious, as held onto despite the cost. The next morning, she arrived early for rounds. Sterling was already in the ER, moving through the unit with the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from knowing no one will oppose you. He stopped at the nursing station where Danielle was reviewing charts, his presence suddenly taking up all the available oxygen in the small space. "Pull those," he said, pointing at her papers. "You're reassigned to supply inventory. Chen will handle primary assessments this rotation." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in front of two other nurses who suddenly became very interested in their own paperwork. Danielle set down her pen. The rotation assignments were: "Are you refusing a direct order?" Sterling's eyebrows rose, performing surprise, performing offense. "Because I can document that. Put it right in your permanent file." She said nothing. She gathered her papers. She moved toward the supply room in the basement, past the morgue doors that were always slightly cold from the refrigeration units inside. But this time, Sterling wasn't finished with her. He followed her into the supply room and waited until she was standing near the back, surrounded by boxes of gauze and saline bags. His voice, when he spoke, had dropped an octave. Had become something colder, more personal. "I know what you're doing," he said. "I can see it. The way you watch the patients. The way you're trying to be something you're not." He stepped closer. "You're not fooling anyone here, Mouse. You're a liability. You're unstable. And I have 3 board members who are very interested in your background." He'd already made calls. She understood this from his tone, from the specific confidence of someone who had already begun to destroy you before you realized the process had started. "I've called in an investigator," Sterling continued. "Discreet. Very thorough. They're going to go through your education records, your previous employment, all those references you provided." He smiled. It was a smile like a wolf showing its teeth, all appetite, no warmth. And when they find what I think they're going to find, we'll have grounds for immediate termination. No severance. No references. No lawsuit because you'll be too busy explaining yourself to federal attorneys. Danielle kept her hand steady. Kept her breathing even. I haven't done anything wrong. Haven't you? Sterling tilted his head. We'll see what the investigator thinks. 30 days, mouse. That's all you have left here. He left the supply room. She stood alone among the boxes, listening to his footsteps fade down the corridor, listening to the hum of the refrigeration units from the morgue 3 doors down, listening to her own heartbeat returning to normal. Her hands, when she looked at them, were still steady. The trembling wasn't there yet. The trembling would come later, in her car, in her apartment, in the small hours of the morning when she couldn't sleep. But here, now, in front of him, steadiness was armor. She called her son that night from the parking lot. Marcus was 17, smart enough to know when something was wrong with his mother, too young to understand that some problems had no solutions, only endurance. "Mom," he said, picking up on the second ring. "Are you okay?" "Fine, baby. I just wanted to hear your voice." But he knew. He always knew. Did something happen at work? She closed her eyes. The patch was in her hand again, the one she always carried, the thread-worn fabric that represented a life that couldn't exist anymore in the light. A life that had been erased, classified, buried under so many layers of national security paperwork that even the truth couldn't dig it out. Just a long shift, she told him. And that was true enough. The convoy arrived at 0300 hours. For hums, doors slamming like rifle shots, boots echoing through the loading bay of Mercy General. Danielle heard it from the 3rd floor, that specific pitch of military urgency, the kind that didn't announce itself on the intercom. She was restocking the pediatric trauma cart when the radio crackled. Incoming. 5 gunshot wounds. ETA 2 minutes. Her hands paused. Just for a moment. Then she finished securing the last package of gauze and moved toward the stairs without running, without rushing, without doing anything that might draw attention from Dr. Sterling, who was somewhere in the building, probably reviewing her file again with that cruel smile he perfected over the past 3 days. The ER bay was controlled chaos. The kind Danielle had seen 100 times before, 20 years of her life compressed into moments that looked like organized panic to anyone who hadn't trained for it. Nurses positioning crash carts. A resident checking vascular access supplies. The attending barking orders about which trauma bay to prep. She slipped into position near the entrance as the first stretcher rolled through, military medics calling out vitals in that clipped, efficient cadence that meant the patient was still fighting. BP 92/58, dropping. GCS 14. Lost consciousness once en route, regained. 5 entry wounds, no exits. Commander James Mitchell lay on the stretcher covered in the rust color of dried blood and the gray pallor of someone who'd been hanging between this world and the next for too long. His left shoulder was exposed where they'd cut away his uniform jacket. And there, unmistakable as a scar on a face, was the birthmark. Irregular shape. The color of old coffee. Exactly the size of her thumbprint, which was the last part of him she'd touched 20 years ago as she lay on top of a 6-month-old infant in the rubble of a checkpoint in Ramadi while rounds tore through the walls around them. Danielle's breath caught. Just caught. Then released. No visible reaction. No trembling hands. No name recognition flashing across her face. She moved into the bay like she'd done this 10,000 times, because she had, and began the assessment protocol while Dr. Sterling arrived, breathless and important, positioning himself at the head of the bed as if his presence alone could hold back the tide. Vitals unstable, Sterling announced, his voice carrying the particular confidence of someone who'd never seen combat medicine, never held someone together with pressure and prayer, never understood that the body tells you everything if you know how to listen. Get 2 large bore 4s running. Type and cross for 8 units. Prep for CT of chest, abdomen, and pelvis. Standard protocol. Safe protocol. The kind of protocol that worked for 80% of trauma cases and failed the remaining 20% by the time you got the results back. Danielle was already moving the stethoscope across Mitchell's chest. Right side first. She heard the breath sounds, diminished but present. Left side. Nothing. Absolute silence where breath should be. Her fingers found the ribs without counting, found the space between them without hesitation, and she felt the tension in his chest cavity like a pressure cooker with no release valve. Tension pneumothorax. His lung hadn't just collapsed, it was pushing his heart aside, compressing everything, building pressure with every breath that couldn't escape. His left side, she said. Quiet. Statement, not question. No air movement. Sterling glanced at the monitors. His oxygenating fine at 91%. The monitors. As if machines understood physics better than the human body. As if a pulse oximeter could feel the pressure building in the pleural space, the way the mediastinum was shifting, the cascade of compensation that would fail in minutes when the pressure spiked above the pressure in his great vessels and his heart simply stopped filling. Tension pneumothorax, Danielle said. Still quiet. Still composed. Voice like someone suggesting coffee. Needs decompression now. Sterling's eyes narrowed. That look she'd learned to recognize over the past 72 hours. The look of a man who did not appreciate being corrected by someone he'd already decided was beneath him. The CT will tell us. He won't make it to CT. She was already reaching for the kit. 14-gauge needle. Alcohol wipe. Finding the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the insertion point burned into her hands from field medicine, from nights she'd spent pulling people back from the exact edge where Mitchell was standing right now. I need you to step back, doctor. Absolutely not. You do not perform procedures without direct physician supervision and explicit orders. I don't care what you think you see. His pressure's climbing, someone called from the monitor station. 88/45. The needle went in like it knew where it was going. Danielle's hands moved with the specific precision that came from having done this while explosions shook the ground, while mortars fell, while the patient was screaming and bleeding and dying and there was nothing between him and death except two hands and the will to refuse to let go. The moment the 14-gauge angiocath punctured the pleural space, the hiss of air escaping was immediate, a sound like relief, like hope, like a pressure cooker finally venting. The rush of negative pressure equalizing. The mechanism of death interrupted. The monitors beeped. Once. Twice. The rhythm steadied. The oxygen saturation climbed. 94. 96. 100. The blood pressure began its slow climb back toward numbers that meant something other than impending cardiac arrest. The trembling in Mitchell's chest, visible, real, the body rejecting death, began to ease. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the next bay, the fluorescent lights buzzing their monotonous hum, the distant thunder of the night pressing against the windows. Dr. Sterling's face had gone the specific shade of purple that came just before institutional violence. Not the kind with blood. The kind with paperwork and phone calls and systems that crushed people who dared to exist outside the hierarchy. His hands were still hovering over the crash cart, useless, which seemed to trouble him more than anything else. Security, he said. Not shouted. Worse than shouting. Calm. Deliberate. The voice of someone who'd already decided your fate and was simply following procedure to make it official. Security to Trauma Bay 4. 2 guards appeared within 3 minutes. Danielle was still monitoring Mitchell's chest for any sign of recollapse, still watching the monitors, still performing her job with the same quiet efficiency that had kept her alive through 2 decades of invisibility. Sterling had already begun pulling papers from his jacket pocket. She recognized them. Had been expecting them since he'd knocked her tray to the floor 4 days ago, since he'd made his bet in the staff lounge, since the moment he'd decided that her competence was a threat to his authority. Practicing medicine without a license, Sterling read, his voice taking on the formal cadence of administrative demolition. Performing an unauthorized procedure without physician supervision. Patient obsession bordering on stalking behavior. Insubordination. These are grounds for immediate termination. Danielle didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Didn't acknowledge the words at all. Just continued her work until one of the guards placed a hand on her shoulder and said, quietly, "Time to go, Ms. Ross." His lung could recollapse, she said. To the guard. To Sterling. To the machines. To no one. Needs continuous monitoring for the next 6 hours. If the hiss doesn't hold, if he starts losing O2 again, he needs another needle. Right here. She pointed to the exact spot, precise as GPS coordinates. Don't wait for a physician. Just do it. He's got maybe 4 minutes once it starts collapsing. That's enough, Sterling said. Remove her. The walk to her locker took 17 seconds. She knew because she counted them, the way she counted everything now, heartbeats, breaths, the distance between one moment and the next. Her hands were steady as she opened the metal door and looked at the life she'd assembled in this place. The succulent, dying from neglect but still green at the base. The cracked ceramic mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse." A photograph of her old commanding officer, Colonel Margaret Hayes, dead for 19 years, smiling in desert camouflage. The faded unit patch from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse, sewn inside the jacket lining where nobody would ever see it, where it had stayed through every background check, every reinvention, every time she'd erased herself just enough to stay invisible. She took out the mug. The succulent. Left the patch. The patch would stay with her. "I'm sorry," the guard said. He was young, maybe 23, with kind eyes and the particular discomfort of someone following orders they didn't believe in. "Whatever's happening here, I'm sorry." "Not your decision," Danielle said. Her voice had gone flat. That was composure too, the absence of emotion, the refusal to give Sterling the satisfaction of seeing anything break. "Take care of him. The Marine in Trauma Bay 4. Whoever takes over, tell them what I said about the lung. Tell them if his pressure climbs again." "I'll tell them," the guard said. The parking lot was dark and cool and full of the smell of rain coming down from somewhere inland. Marcus was waiting by her car, confused and angry in that particular way teenage boys got when the world violated their understanding of how it was supposed to work. His mother came home. She did her job. She went back out. Those were the rules. "What the hell happened?" he demanded. "Mom, what did you do?" She opened the trunk and placed the mug and the succulent on the floor. Started to close it. Paused. The image of Mitchell's birthmark. The weight of that 6-month-old body in her arms as the world exploded around them. The specific moment 20 years ago when she'd chosen to stay and he'd chosen to live. All the years in between. The invisibility. The quiet. The careful crafting of a life that didn't exist. "We need to drive," she said. But that wasn't the worst part. The sound of her apartment door closing was final, the kind of final that echoes when there's nothing left to lose. 3 hours earlier, Sterling had smiled while handing her the termination papers, his voice dripping honey over broken glass. "Your credentials are under investigation, Ms. Ross. 3 board members are reviewing your file personally." The way he said it, you'd think she'd poisoned someone instead of saving a life. The unauthorized needle decompression. That's what he called it in the official letter. Not an emergency procedure. Not what kept a man's lung from crushing his heart. Unauthorized. As if protocols mattered more than breathing. The cardboard box sat on her passenger seat, her life reduced to what could fit in something that once held printer paper. The cracked mug from the ER break room, someone had tried to glue it back together 3 years ago and given up. A succulent, brown and withering, that a patient's daughter had brought her on New Year's Day. And the photo. Always the photo. Senior Chief Maria Vasquez, laughing in the Ramadi dust, her arm around a younger version of Danielle wearing the same rank insignia, the same call sign patch now hidden inside a jacket lining in Danielle's closet. 20 years dead. 20 years erased from every official record except the ones locked in government vaults that Danielle was never supposed to access again. The rain started at 2,215 hours, hard, the kind that made the Norfolk streets shine like oil. Danielle sat in her car in the Mercy General parking lot for 40 minutes, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be home, crying into that cracked mug, preparing for a future that no longer existed. Mitchell was still inside, still in ICU bed for 07, and something in her, the part that had survived Ramadi, that had pulled 37 Marines out of an ambush, that had learned to read danger the way other people read clocks, that part was screaming that he wasn't safe. Not safe. The thought moved through her like electricity. She still had her old badge in her jacket pocket. Security hadn't deactivated it yet. The system always lagged behind the paperwork by a few hours, sometimes longer. She knew this. She'd counted on this, though she wouldn't admit to herself that she'd been counting on anything at all. At 2,247 hours, she clipped the badge to her scrubs, the same scrubs she was still wearing because there hadn't been time to change, and walked through the employee entrance like she still belonged here. The ICU corridor hummed with the particular quiet of a night shift. One nurse at the main station, focused on charting. The hallway stretched toward 407, fluorescent lights casting everything in that peculiar hospital twilight that made time meaningless. Danielle moved without hurrying, without hesitating, the way someone who belonged moves through spaces designed to contain her. The Marine guard who was supposed to be rotated onto Mitchell's room was gone, shift change. The timing gap that made her spine go cold. The door to 407 opened silently. Mitchell was asleep, his chest rising in the rhythm of mild sedation, the chest tube bubbling softly with each breath. Good bubble. Consistent output. She checked the dressing, no additional bleeding, no signs of infection. His vitals on the monitor, BP stable at 118/72, heart rate 82, O2 sat 96. The small victories that meant survival. She'd been in the room maybe 2 minutes when she heard the sound that made her entire nervous system shift into the predator frequency. The door crashed open. Not a nurse's entrance. Not a doctor's measured step. The sound of door hinges meeting violence, of boots clearing a threshold like they owned it. 2 men in tactical gear. Black fatigues, suppressors already mounted on weapons held at ready position, movements that spoke of training and purpose. The first one through had his weapon raised toward Mitchell before Danielle's brain even finished processing the threat. The second stayed on the door. The nurse, the first one, said into a radio clipped to his chest. Confirm. Danielle didn't think. Thought is the disease of people who have time. Her body moved on programming older than words, muscle memory from 2 decades of staying alive in places designed to kill you. She threw herself across Mitchell's body, arms spread, using her weight as a shield, her voice dropping 3 octaves, stand down. The first shot came with a sound like a mechanical cough. The suppressor turned murder into something that sounded like a stapler. The bullet hit her left shoulder, upper trapezius. She registered with the clinical part of her brain that never stopped running analysis. Not the lung. Not the artery. Survivable. She didn't move. The second shot came too fast, the shooter advancing because her blood was hitting the monitors and the monitors were triggering alarms, and there was a moment, one fraction of a second, where he thought she was dying. The bullet punched through her right side just below her ribs, tearing through muscle and grazing something that made her vision spark white. Her breath came in a gasp she couldn't suppress, but she stayed positioned over Mitchell, her arms still extended, her body still a barrier. The third shot came as the shooter moved closer, as if proximity mattered, as if being a meter away instead of 3 meters away changed the calculus of a suppressed weapon. This one tore through her lower abdomen at an angle, and that one she felt, bright hot pain that meant internal bleeding, that meant her body was already beginning the cascade toward organ failure. Blood was pooling. She could feel it soaking through her scrubs, could see it spraying across the heart monitor, across the 4-pole, across Mitchell's sheets. Her vision was starting to tunnel at the edges like someone was slowly closing an iris shutter on her consciousness. But she didn't move. She couldn't move. Her weight stayed on top of him, her body still shielded, her voice steady as stone. Don't you move. The second tactical operator was advancing now, and Danielle was calculating the trajectory of the fourth shot, calculating whether she could roll enough to keep Mitchell out of the line of fire, calculating whether her lung was punctured or just compressed, when the ICU door exploded inward and hospital security flooded through, 3 officers, weapons drawn, shouting commands that sounded like they came through water. The tactical operators ran. Training kicked in, they'd achieved their psychological objective, silence the witness. They were facing defensive force, not part of the contract. They were in a building with security cameras, escalation hazard. They moved toward the back stairs with the smooth precision of men trained to make tactical retreats. Danielle collapsed onto Mitchell, her blood mixing with his, her hand still gripping his shoulder as if gravity alone wasn't going to drag her down. One of the security officers was calling code blue, calling trauma surgery, calling for backup. Someone was applying pressure to her abdomen, and Danielle heard her own voice from very far away, tell them penetrating trauma. Gunshot wounds, 3 sites. She did this protecting the patient. Then nothing for a while. The next 3 days existed behind a curtain of morphine and institutional beige. When Danielle woke in her own hospital bed, the irony was not lost on her. There were FBI agents in the hallway outside her door. Their jacket said FBI. Their posture said federal property. The fur in her arm was running saline and antibiotics, her abdomen was a sculpture of bandages and pain management, and her left shoulder was immobilized so completely she might as well have been fashioned into a statue. Sterling came to her room at some point, she was never clear on when. The morphine was still working, her brain was cotton, and she might have been hallucinating or might have been experiencing the final insult of a woman who'd survived worse only to have it all cost her. He stood at the foot of her bed, his suit jacket pristine, his face arranged in an expression of concern that looked like a mask made of wax. "You understand we're proceeding with criminal charges," he said. His voice sounded like it came through a tunnel. "Trespassing. Practicing without a valid license. Unauthorized use of hospital equipment." She didn't respond. Didn't have the luxury of response. "You'll be lucky to avoid prison, Mouse," he continued, and the nickname fell like a slap from someone who would never understand that she'd been called worse by people who'd meant it more. "Your legal exposure is significant." Then he was gone, or maybe she dreamed he was there. The morphine made everything the same temperature. They discharged her on day 4 because a hospital bed for a formerly employed nurse with 3 gunshot wounds and no insurance was a liability no institution could afford. An FBI agent, young, professional, neither kind nor unkind, helped her into a wheelchair. Her apartment lease had terminated. Marcus was staying with his friend Devon's family. The FBI had frozen her accounts pending investigation. The backpack of medication sat beside her like a small funeral arrangement. The rain came again when they wheeled her out, and she sat at the bus stop at dawn with her cardboard box on her lap. Same box. Same contents. The cracked mug, the dying succulent with leaves gone paper brown, the photograph of Maria Vasquez laughing in Ramadi dust. Her shoulder screamed with each breath. Her abdomen throbbed in a rhythm that meant infection was still a possibility, that her body was still engaged in the work of survival. A bus pulled up to the stop, doors opening, and Danielle looked at the driver, a woman maybe her age, maybe younger, someone living a life that made sense in ways hers no longer did. She didn't board. She had no idea where she'd go. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was still coming. The conference room door burst open at 8:06 a.m., and Marcus Ross stood in the threshold holding a locked metal case like it weighed 1,000 pounds. His voice shook. "Mom, they need to see these. I don't care what you were ordered to do." The hospital board had convened to review Dr. Sterling's recommendation for criminal charges, termination for cause, unauthorized procedures, gross negligence. Board members in tailored suits sat around a mahogany table scattered with incident reports. Sterling stood at the head, composed, believing the institutional weight of his position was armor enough. He'd made calls. He had allies. He had a contract. Marcus set the case down and stepped back. The hospital administrator's trembling hand reached for the lock. The click echoed off the polished walls like a judge's gavel. She opened the case and began reading the papers inside, and her voice, a voice that had fired dozens of people without flinching, became barely a whisper. Bronze Star with Valor. Citation date, March 14, 2004. For heroic actions under fire in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Sterling's face went pale. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Silver Star. The administrator's hand shook as she lifted the next page. Another silver star. Purple heart with 2 clusters. She looked up, her eyes moving between the documents and Sterling. These are authenticated. These are federal military records. The conference room door opened again. Commander James Mitchell walked through it in dress blues, still favoring his left side where the bullet wounds were healing, his uniform immaculate. Behind him came a SEAL team leader, 6'4", jaw like a loading ramp, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change when he entered a room. The commander stepped forward and spoke with the clarity of someone who'd commanded troops under fire. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. Navy Cross recipient. Sterling's face went the color of old concrete. The board members exchanged glances, understanding in that moment that they'd been played. That they'd believed the wrong person. The SEAL team leader's voice carried the weight of someone describing a legend. I was 19 years old in Ramadi. Echo Platoon, attached to 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Senior Chief Ross pulled my entire unit out of an ambush in the Jolan district. We were pinned, no cover, enemy fire from 3 positions, and she moved through that street like she was made of ghost smoke. He paused, and his eyes went distant with memory. She took shrapnel. Pieces of IED fragmentation that should have killed her. But she kept moving. Kept us moving. Got 16 Marines out alive. Another board member started typing something into his phone, damage control, lawyers, calculations of liability. Bronze Star with Valor, the SEAL team leader continued. Second Silver Star for actions protecting civilian non-combatants. Purple Heart with 2 clusters for the wounds she sustained. His voice shifted, became heavier. But that's not why we're here. We're here because 2 days ago, Senior Chief Ross took 3 rounds, 9mm, ballistic trauma to the shoulder, ribs, and abdomen, while shielding Commander Mitchell from a sanctioned assassination attempt. Sterling tried to stand. His legs didn't work. The FBI liaison stepped forward, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. This woman had seen 100 crime scenes and 1,000 lies. She carried a badge that outranked every board connection Sterling possessed. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross has been in witness protection for the past 20 years, she said. Protected identity status, Level 4 security protocols. She testified against Blackheart defense contractors in a federal case involving illegal arms trafficking and unauthorized overseas operations. That case is still pending. That case is still active. The liaison's eyes locked onto Sterling. You initiated an investigation into a protected federal witness. You contacted references that were federal cover identities. You requested employment verification from agencies that don't exist. You left a decorated combat veteran vulnerable to assassination by terminating her employment and deactivating her security access during an active threat window. Sterling's hands were shaking now. Real tremors, the kind that come from understanding that you'd stepped into a canyon and there was no way back to the rim. I didn't know, he whispered. Her credentials didn't indicate. Stop talking, the FBI liaison said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The hospital's chief legal counsel walked in, and everyone understood that Sterling's career had already ended before he walked into this room. The counsel carried a folder the size of a hardcover novel. She opened it without ceremony. Patient complaint filed by Marcus Webb, September 3. Patient care assessment indicates dismissive and demeaning behavior by Dr. Sterling despite critical vital sign deterioration. Ignored by HR. She flipped a page. Nurse Olivia Chen filed harassment complaint. September 5. Retaliatory scheduling initiated against Chen the following day. Complaint buried in personnel files. Incident report filed by night shift supervisor regarding a blood type order discrepancy on Commander Mitchell's chart that would have resulted in incompatible transfusion. That error would have been fatal. Senior Chief Ross caught the discrepancy. Sterling's phone buzzed. Then again. Then again. Text messages arriving in waves, each one a small death. Board connection severing ties. The country club revoking his membership. The medical society distancing itself. Lawyers declining representation due to conflict of interest. Each text a door slamming shut. The security guard who'd escorted Danielle out with her cardboard box 3 days ago now approached Sterling with an identical box. The same guard, the same box, the symbolism so perfect and terrible that several board members flinched. The guard's voice was quiet, but it carried something sharper than anger. Satisfaction. I believe you know the way out, sir. Sterling's face flushed crimson, then purple. This is absurd. I'm chief of emergency medicine. I have a contract. I have tenure. You can't. The board chairman removed his glasses and set them on the table with deliberate precision. When he spoke, his voice was the voice of someone executing a sentence that had already been decided. Had a contract, doctor. Terminated for cause. Effective immediately. The negligence lawsuits are already being filed. Commander Mitchell's family. 3 other military families. 7 civilian patients. You'll be fortunate to find work teaching CPR at community college for minimum wage after these clear the courts. The chairman paused. I suggest you find representation. Sterling reached for the box with both hands. His expensive watch, the $12,000 Omega he wore to make subordinates feel small, caught the light as his hands trembled. He looked around the room searching for allies and found only the quiet satisfaction of people watching someone finally experience consequence. He stood. The chair scraped against the floor with a sound like ice cracking. He walked toward the door, past the SEAL team leader who didn't move, past Commander Mitchell who watched with the expressionless stare of someone who'd already decided he wasn't worth the emotional energy. Marcus stood in the doorway, arms crossed, face hard with a rage that his mother had taught him to contain. Sterling's last image in Mercy General was the same, walking past the nurse's station where Danielle had worked in silence, past the ER where he'd called a Navy Cross recipient mouse, past the supply closet where he'd cornered her and told her she was qualified for nothing. Everyone watched. No one spoke. The silence was thick, textured, like it had weight. The final image of Sterling was his BMW in the parking lot, cardboard box on the passenger seat, his phone ringing with calls from lawyers he couldn't afford. 2 weeks later, Mercy General's main atrium filled with people. Danielle stood in dress blues for the first time in 20 years. The uniform fit her like it remembered her body, like her body remembered the weight of it. Her right arm rested in a medical sling, the shoulder wound still healing, and she held her left arm at her side because the abdominal trauma made deep breaths a negotiation with pain. But her spine was straight. Her eyes were clear. Commander Mitchell stood beside her in his dress blues. Marcus stood on her other side in a borrowed suit, his hand resting on her shoulder. The hospital board chairman stepped to the microphone, and his voice carried the weight of someone making history. We unveil today a plaque renaming our emergency department in honor of a woman whose service has never wavered, whose courage has never dimmed, and whose sacrifice changed the trajectory of this hospital and everyone in it. He gestured to the wall where the new bronze plaque gleamed. The Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross Emergency Center. In honor of courage that never quits. The SEAL team leader read a citation for her action stopping the assassination attempt on Commander Mitchell, the 3 rounds she'd absorbed, the shield position she maintained until security arrived, the way she'd chosen to bleed so someone else wouldn't have to. He recommended her for a 4th Bronze Star with valor. His voice didn't waver, but his eyes held something that looked like grief and pride braided together. Commander Mitchell stepped to the microphone, and the room went so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming overhead. Senior Chief Ross saved my life when I was 6 months old in Ramadi. An ambush. Multiple contacts. She took fragmentation wounds that should have killed her, but she shielded me with her body. He paused, and in that pause was 20 years of survival. She spent 2 decades invisible. Silent. Serving. Not asking for recognition. Not asking for anything except the chance to protect people. 20 years later, she saved my life again, taking rounds meant for me. She did what warriors do. She protected the mission, the patient, and the people around her, without hesitation, without question. The staff applauded, many of them crying. The nurses who'd watched Sterling humiliate Danielle now understood what they'd witnessed, not weakness absorbing cruelty, but discipline absorbing insult. A decorated operator in civilian clothes, maintaining her cover, maintaining her composure, maintaining her mission. Marcus held his mother's hand, and his eyes were locked on her face like he was seeing her for the first time. He finally understood why she'd never fought back. Why she did push-ups in bathrooms at 4 a.m. Why she touched that faded Ramadi unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining before every shift, her fingers tracing the embroidered symbols of a unit that would have followed her into hell. The security guard who'd placed Sterling's termination box in his shaking hands now stood at attention and saluted. The FBI liaison announced that the Blackheart defense contractor's prosecution was moving forward, accelerated by both Ross and Mitchell's testimony. The case that had stolen 20 years of Danielle's life was finally going to end. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of something else, a framed photograph on the wall beside Danielle's Navy Cross citation. The faded Ramadi unit patch, finally visible, finally honored. And beside it, on the new nurse's station desk, the dying succulent that had come home in her cardboard box, now thriving, green, alive. A young nurse approached hesitantly, her name tag reading Garcia, RN. Her voice was uncertain. "Senior Chief? Could you teach me how you stay so calm when everything's falling apart?" Danielle touched her shoulder, and her voice, the voice that had commanded Marines under fire, that had been silenced for 20 years, carried the weight of experience and the clarity of someone who'd finally stopped hiding. "I'll teach you everything I know." The screen faded with text, "Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs." Subscribe to hear more stories about the warriors walking among us. Like this video if you believe the quiet ones are often the strongest. Comment below, have you ever been wrong about someone you underestimated?